Yep, sounds pretty good.
Great. Okay, great. So thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Sakano, for the opportunity. I always love doing these kinds of things. I'm Dr. Eric Shibuya. I'm a professor of strategic studies at Marine Corps, at Command Staff College, Marine Corps University down in Quantico. And I've been there since 2007. Prior to that, from 2000 to 2006, I was at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is in Hawaii. It's a direct reporting branch to Indo-PACOM. And while I was there, my specialties are Oceania and Southeast Asia mostly, but you can't do those things without doing China, obviously. And what I also did there is I stood up what is now called the PACOM orientation course and the counterterrorism courses while I was there. So as I said, my work is mostly in Southeast Asia and Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands. I do some work on post-conflict demobilization and things, which is not going to be relevant, hopefully, for this discussion today. So as Lieutenant Colonel Sakano asked, about a half an hour I'll talk and then open the floor up for some questions here. I will note, I just got done working with the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab on a war game that we brought in a dozen Marines. That it wasn't meant to just be Marines. We were looking for volunteers. I got a full MAGTF split though, distribution. And those Marines put together, they played Red in a classified war game, in some area of the Indo-PACOM region where they played a large Asian country, and so we use that to test this first iteration of this. They played Red in several moves to deal with quick military objectives prior to third-party / United States intervention. We're gonna redo parts of that game in July, right after graduation, where the team that I ended up putting together will play Red against a larger team that will play Blue, and we're going to look at force design. The whole idea is here to look at Marine Corps force design. We played an MLR in one of the two teams that played during the game, but it didn't get enough play. That was not due to capabilities or any other issues. It was due to time constraints. The game that we're playing took a little longer to set up and run through the first set of iterations. That by the time we could actually deal with things like an MLR being in place and actually starting to move, we had just gotten the first couple of contacts for that before we ran out of time. And so we're going to try and move forward from that game, hopefully in July. All right, so reality today, PACOM. I'm going to talk real quick. I'm going to go with adversaries, and then I'm going to talk about allies and partners for a little bit. So the adversaries, obviously, the main one, as you all know, is China, right? It's a new world of great power competition. Great power competition never went away. We were just distracted by other things. There were other priorities, alligators closer to the boat. You just had to deal with those kinds of things. When we say adversaries in Indo-PACOM, though, we can't also mistake North Korea, right? And when it comes to great powers, we shouldn't forget that Russia is also an Asia-Pacific power, right? It is the Eurasian continent. It does touch the Pacific Islands, the Pacific Ocean, and that area very close to sort of NORTHCOM and in terms of Alaska, and that area is going to become increasingly more important for the United States, for Russia, for all of the Arctic Circle, as what seems to be the general predictions of things like climate change is that that area of the North Arctic cap will become increasingly more water, right? And more water year round. So those sea lines of communications are going to change the nature or change the characteristics of some of the conflicts that we're going to see, because those new logistics trains will actually be things that we haven't had to consider before. All right. So that's all I'm going to really say about Russia. We can talk a bit more about that if you want to in the Q&A. I will mention North Korea again, right? North Korea is one of those, if you're a Star Trek fan, right? North Korea is that Kobayashi Maru, is that no-win scenario. There are no great answers. We just finished in command staff in December. We close out the fall semester with a discussion of rogue states, and we talk about Iran and North Korea. And the real issue when it comes to North Korea is, as we phrase the question, is how do you engage a country that wants no engagement, right? The United for North Korea, the best thing in the world for them to maintain power, to keep hold of the regime, is to not have any kind of engagement, right? Because any kind of engagement actually does open that crack to show that, well, life really sucks in North Korea, and life is better almost any place else in the world than North Korea, right? So if you're the Kim regime, if you're that government, right, the whole idea is you shut off information, right? So you don't want more electricity, you don't want more internet, you don't want more communication, right? Because any of those things actually erodes your capability to maintain the power that you already have, right? So all of the discussions that we have when it comes to North Korea about, further engagement, better diplomacy, all of those kinds of things, those are all based on this fundamental assumption that they want engagement, that they want to improve the lives of their population. Well, what if you just take that off the table? They don't, right? You start with the idea that they simply want to stay in power, and anything that changes the nature of how they deal with their population would actually diminish their ability to stay in power, makes it really, really difficult. The thing about North Korea also is that when we talk about their missile capability and their nuclear capability, those are the things we worry about, and we should, obviously. But we only draw the circle halfway, right? We always draw this, like if you put the missiles in North Korea and you draw the range out, we always go east, right? Like, do they hit Guam? Do they hit Hawaii? Whatever, all of those areas, right? We forget that the circle goes in the other direction, right? And China does not. China completely understands that what they have in North Korea is that really annoying, really dangerous sort of ally, right? But it's a government they really have no control over, right? And so whenever we go, well, we would love to have the North Korean regime collapse. That's really true, right? China would love that too on some extent, but they also know that they're going to end up holding the bag, right? Because China and North Korea are right next to each other. And while a collapsed North Korea is really bad for us, it's worse for China. And so China's incentive to maintain at least this sort of minimal ability to influence North Korea and to keep it standing in this whatever horrific standard it has in terms of its population, that's better for China. China in many ways would love to see a North Korea that was more placated under them, right? More amenable to them, but they're not going to get that. They would definitely not like a North Korea either unified under the South and more amenable to the United States. That's a complete non-starter. And then the middle range is sort of a collapsed North Korea is worse for China than it is for us, even for South Korea. And so China's tightrope walk for the North Korean situation is really difficult. You think we have problems for North Korea, they have it worse. And so just a quick story before I go on to China. When I was at the Asia Pacific Center, the first couple of years from 2000 to 2002, we actually had PRC representation, not PLA, but they were PRC guys who were ostensibly part of foreign affairs. We do think some of them were probably, military intelligence or their intelligence community guys. But we used to get guys from the PRC. And over lunch one time, there were about 4 or 5 of us, some students from all over the Indo-PACOM AOR, and then a couple of professors. We're all sitting down having lunch. Beautiful time to be in Hawaii outside. And one of the professors, who's actually a Korea specialist, actually said, okay, so if North Korea collapses and there's this refugee crisis, right? This is in 2002. If there's this refugee crisis, like, that the North Koreans aren't really going to go south, right? I mean, there's the DMZ, there's all those mines, there's all of that, right? That's not where they're going. They're going to go north, right? So as the specialist said, he says, so, it just makes more sense if you actually started working with us. Remember, this is 18 years ago, in terms of managing, the eventual sort of collapse of the Pyongyang regime. And the Chinese student looked at him and said, "You're right, right? If the humanitarian crisis of a North Korean collapse, they're going to come north. But if they come north, we're just going to put 50 cows along the Yalu." Right? Said it casually, just said it like it was nothing, like it was Tuesday. This is what you do. You just mow down a whole bunch of North Koreans who are running north, right? Now, the stunning part to that is he was dead serious. And perhaps the real question might be is if that's something you can say in 2002, is it still something you can say in 2021, right? Is that still the sort of contingency plan for a North Korean collapse for China? And the answer is I don't know, right? I don't know where that goes. But that is certainly from about 18 years ago, the way that at least respected enough to come get let loose in Hawaii for 3 months, Chinese officials thought about the North Korean collapse as a scenario. All right, let's get to China then, right? So China has this sort of interesting thing, right? We always try and, if we don't fight the last war, we try and find parallels to previous wars or tensions to help us understand what's the best way to look at a conflict. When it comes to China, we usually use things like Cold War as a concept, right? And whether or not a new Cold War is looming with United States-China tensions, right? Let me make the argument that's a tough and probably improper comparison, right? When you look at the United States and the Soviet Union, when you look at the bipolar conflict, right, what you have there is, we always talk about it in terms of a couple of things, but there are really a couple of things on one side and a couple of things on the other. For the Cold War, the United States was a capitalist government and also a liberal democratic government, a Republican form of representation, right? Power in, of, by, and for the people, that kind of thing, right? So sort of a liberal democratic order, right? Power for the people, by the people, and a capitalist market, free market economy kind of government. The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, right, was a socialist, planned, state-directed economy and an authoritarian government, right? An oligarchy of Communist Party members that held power, right? And we forget that both of those dimensions matter. So when we say that we won the Cold War, what we forget is we didn't actually win the Cold War because somebody said, oh, authoritarian government, liberal democratic government, I like this one better, right? We really won, fundamentally, when it comes down to winning the Cold War. We won because we had better stuff, not a better idea about how to run a government. And I'm big on running the government by liberal democratic rules, by the way. But because we had better blue jeans, we made pens, we had cars in different colors, we offered all of this stuff. You could go to McDonald's, like that stuff was incredible, right? All of those kinds of things, right? On some level, this is base and materialistic matter, right? So we need to remember that, because the problem that we face today is that China is an authoritarian government, right? Centralized control, and a free market economy, right? So when we fight the Cold War and we say, hey, we can bribe you with blue jeans or pens or all that other stuff, the Chinese now go, I can get pens. Hell, I make the pens. I make the blue jeans. I make, the cars. I make those things, right? I can be a Chinese Communist Party member and a millionaire. So tell me again what you've got to offer, right? And we haven't really thought about that. So the Cold War analogy really doesn't work for us. And if we keep trying to impose that, I think we're going to end up on the short end. Because again, right, if part of why we won the Cold Wars was because we had better stuff, we can't say that about us and China now, right? Because China makes most of our stuff. And we got to remember that, right? So the Cold War analogy doesn't work. Does the adversary analogy work? Probably, right? there are pieces to what China wants in a new global system that are not amenable to what the United States wants. And it's not amenable to what our allies and partners want. Now, the real question then becomes, how much are we and how much is China willing to risk to achieve those objectives? And that's the real question, right? As Lieutenant Colonel Sicano asked, right? Or it's like, nobody wants this war, but history is rife with wars that we have experienced, that when we look back in the cold light of history and reflection, we go, we shouldn't have started that, right? We shouldn't have fought that. Right? It's like nobody wanted to fight that war, but yet here we are, is kind of the thing, right? Wars start because of miscalculation, wars start because of emotion, right? That wonderful Clausewitzian trilogy really matters, right? Hatred matters. Like, people go to war not because they went, oh, there's stuff I want. That is one of the reasons. But sometimes people go to war because they go, oh, I hate the other guy. And that starts a whole lot of wars, right? Or if they don't go, I may not hate the other guy, but I'm pretty sure he hates me, and I better get my shot in before he gets more powerful, right? The whole Thucydides trinity of fear, honor, and interest, all of those things matter, right? And out of those things, when we talk about Thucydides, fear and honor are not rational, right? Be really clear about this, right? Fear and honor are not rational calculations, right? People have phobias for lots of things that don't make any sense. People are afraid of things that they don't understand, and that matters when it comes to war initiation or the rise of conflict. So what can we then say then about what China wants, right? China would love to rise to achieve its goals without getting into any kind of higher tensions with the United States. That's absolutely true. Now, the real question then becomes is, what does it want? Most people, I think, in the Chinese scholar community, folks like me in this sort of larger Asia community, think that what China would want is a larger, greater recognition of its place as the dominant force in the Asia Pacific, right? There are folks who I think make the argument that it's all about the whole sort of global dominance, and I don't think that's true. I think they want global access, but not global dominance. And in many ways, let's point this out, right? If you look at what the United States did in sort of end of World War II and that level and that experience, what you really see is the United States achieving global dominance by default. But then the quick rise of the Soviet Union means you're not really dominant. We have global access and we have global interests, but we force and push for dominance in very specific areas, right? Mostly in the Asia Pacific, and then in Europe with NATO, right? We'll leave the Western Hemisphere aside here because it's one of the larger. The United States is lucky because of its geographic sort of situation, allowing it to get the Western Hemisphere in many ways by default. That sort of experience is actually important for us to remember. Whenever we talk about China's potential to rise, we should recognize that we were very lucky, have been very lucky for our geography. Oceans on either side, relatively friendly, and for the most part, stable nations in the north and south, right? China doesn't have that, right? If you look at China's geopolitical situation, surrounded by hostilities, right? You know, and self-inflicted or not, that's not the point here, right? Surrounded by states that don't like it, surrounded by states that would rather it not be as dominant as it is, but also surrounded by states that recognize it as a great market and great production value, right? The economic inroads that China has made throughout the world, but let's just talk about the Asia Pacific, are significant, right? To the point where you get the situation where no one wants to choose between a United States security compact and a Chinese economic compact, right? They would love to free ride on both of those benefits. Of course they would, right? China would love them to move closer to their realm of influence, and we would honestly like them to move closer to our realm of influence. And this is the tension that we sort of face today, right? So China would love to free ride continually on what the United States has set up in the world, but it would like to get at least a greater cut, or at least greater recognition as being the dominant force in the Asia Pacific. That is a problem for the United States. That is a problem for Japan. So I'm going to move to allies here. Those are really the two issues that we face. The United States has several other allies, of course: Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, to some extent New Zealand, but still not officially an ally. But none of those countries besides Japan has the same kind of both proximity to the Chinese, the history with the Chinese, and also the economic competition with the Chinese. Right now, when I say economic competition, that's no, it's not parity. Right, the Japanese economy is nowhere close to the Chinese economy, but it is still a significant part of the global economy that it does have sway. And the Japanese are trying to figure out how they can still leverage some of that to maintain a greater influence, or at least to degrade the influence of the Chinese as the Chinese economy starts to rise. That's incredibly difficult for the Japanese. They haven't, the only way they're going to do that is a greater influx and connection with the United States. I mean, greater. And it also probably means for the Japanese an exploration of a greater military contribution globally, but certainly, but mostly in the region. We don't have any real issues with that, but a lot of that is because the United States is very bad at history, right? And so we don't see, when we say Japan that would become increasingly militarily capable, maybe actually amending, if not erasing, the self-defense precepts in their constitution, right? We don't see an issue with that because for us, Japan is, like 60 years old, like 70 years old, right? We go from Japan, as far as we're concerned, starts at about 1945, right? And they've been very friendly to us. We've had some blips in relationships, but generally speaking, they like us and we like them, right? Again, we're bad at history, right? Go ask the Chinese, go ask the South Koreans, who are our friends, how much, how they'll feel about a increasingly militaristic Japan, and you'll get a whole different answer. That's true. We've allowed for, one of the things that our security umbrella has created is we allowed for the Japanese and the Koreans to be able to have a security umbrella that didn't require them communicating with each other. And that's a really difficult thing. When we did it in NATO, when we did it in Europe, right, all of those other nations had to talk to each other, right? Because it's a multilateral kind of defense agreement, which meant for West Germany and then later for larger Germany, West Germany had to go through all kinds of apologies, statements of remorse, the whole thing in terms of their role in World War II. West Germany had to take on all of that heat, right, in an effort to make the NATO arrangement work because there was a larger enemy. Well, in the Pacific, that was not true. In the Pacific, you have this hub and spoke system. You have a U.S.-Japan relationship, a U.S.-Korea relationship, etc. And when you have a hub and spoke relationship, what you've done is there's no obligations for any of the spokes to connect, right? And so Japan and Korea didn't have to have any conversations over things like comfort women or other war crimes or any of those kinds of atrocities, any of those historical scars, right? And so in Japan, you got history books, but in West Germany, history books are damned honest, like really scarily honest in terms of the role Germany played in World War II, right? And they take that on. In Japan, that's not true, right? You have Japanese school books that talk about the whole reason we use the term comfort women is that comes from the Japanese history books, right? It comes from the Japanese school books of these Korean women that, just wanted to provide comfort to the Japanese soldiers that were on the peninsula during World War II. Because we apparently can't use the words sex slaves, right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? These women were put into houses of prostitution and used as sex slaves by the Japanese army. That's what we want to say. But, we use the term comfort women because we've allowed that kind of discussion or that naming to be the one that we use. Japan and Korea haven't had that discussion, and in many ways we're about 75 years down the road now. It's going to be really difficult to have that, but you probably need to if you want closer, better regional security. As the United States does recognize that for all of its greater capability, right, as Colonel Sakano already pointed out, right, this war doesn't help anybody, right? The idea that the United States will dominate in any battlefield anymore is less and less probable. Doesn't mean that we're not going to win. Doesn't mean we're not the favored team, right? But it does mean that we are going to have to look at, one, increasing casualties on our side for any of these scenarios that get really down and dirty, and two, a need for a greater regional security architecture from other players, allies, and partners, for us to get inside of the Chinese West, right? To get and to be there with capabilities that will matter, right? So let me quickly do some allies and then I'll talk about and partners and then talk about some capabilities here, right? So I mentioned Japan. I think the other partner we really should think about is, the other ally we should think about is a problematic one right now. It's the Philippines, right? The Philippines are a longtime ally. We still have a security partnership with them. We still have a treaty partnership with them. President Duterte has not been our friend. And in many ways, the last 4 years of President Duterte and President Trump have been, have been really bad. And it's one of those really interesting sort of situations when President Duterte was first elected. A lot of people called him the Philippine Donald Trump, right? Because he's flamboyant. He's sort of, in many ways, while he is a local politician, he was in many ways viewed as an outsider of the Manila orbit and all of those kinds of things. And then when President Trump was elected, a lot of people did say, "Oh, this would be good. Like these are two men who understand each other, right?" Well, one of the things that you probably know is that when two alpha males get together, it almost never works like that, right? And that's really what that was. That anyone who really thought that, oh yeah, no, here's a guy who's, and I'll be a little flippant here, right? But here's a guy who's kind of arrogant, egotistical. He's been really successful, so he's kind of full of himself. Let's put another guy just like that and put them together, and I'm sure they'll be best friends. I don't know why anybody thought that, right? And so in many ways, the deterioration of the United States-Philippine relationship had a lot to do, arguably, with just that kind of clash of egos. Now, that said, Duterte's slow withdrawal and even siding with China also signals something else. We can't just go, oh, it's because the two guys up top were kind of egotistical and they really kind of full of themselves. Two alpha males, they never get along. That's not going to work. I get it, but now it'll work better. No, I don't. That might be true, but I think we should also look at the possibility that Duterte is not an idiot, and he might be actually, if not hedging his bets, he's picking a winner, right? The United States has been a long-standing partner, ally of the Philippines, but things change, right? And it's possible that what you see in Duterte's behavior was, I don't think, right? Duterte says, I don't think that the security guarantee of the United States is either credible or necessary. And so I will now move my orbit closer to China's, right? Because that's the other way you can prevent a war, right? In the Asia Pacific region, I can side with the United States and be an ally and try and deter China, or I can just bandwagon with a rising China. I could pick a winner, right? And maybe I'm picking the Philippines, and this came to a real significant head in June of last year when they made the announcement that they were going to abrogate the visiting forces agreement. This was a big deal. I gave several talks in the weeks that followed that one because, as someone said, well, it's like, well, they still have an alliance. We still have this alliance agreement. I said, yes, but if an alliance agreement without the ability to place forces on the ground is an alliance, right? It doesn't. If you don't have a visiting forces agreement, and there is no way the United States would put American troops on foreign soil without a visiting forces agreement / status of the forces agreement, right? We just don't do that. Not on a permanent basis, not on a regular, significant rotating basis. It just doesn't make any sense to do that. So if you don't have one, you're not going to put forces in that area. And if you can't put forces in that area, then your deterrent value of your presence is non-existent, right? So the VFA was absolutely critical to having a real credible presence in the Philippines. Now, the Philippine government then stated that they would hold off on the abrogation, right? It takes 90 days or 6 months, I forget what it was. And just recently, November 10th or 11th, they announced again that they were postponing that abrogation. I think that last announcement is actually critical because obviously it came after the election. And I think that they were in fact waiting to see who won the election. So whether or not they will now get back to the table with the new Biden administration and negotiate whatever it is that makes it a better deal for the Philippine government to have a visiting VFA with the United States that will now then be more lasting rather than being in this weird limbo that we are in at right now. I think remains to be seen, but I think we should be. I think we can be optimistic that in fact is something that will actually happen. So I think the Philippines is the other sort of ally we need to look at. In terms of partners, I think two are critical as we look at countries in the region that matter in terms of how we balance out with China, and that's Singapore and India. Singapore, obviously a hub, logistics hub. It has significant relationships with both countries, got significant cultural ties with China, right? We put 4 LCSs in Singapore on a regular basis, although the last couple of years, I don't think we've actually made that commitment due to other equipment restraints and shortcomings. But Singapore, I think, is an important kind of hub that we need to matter. Singapore is playing a really interesting game. Singapore is trying to be that country that, because it's so small, but because it's also so important, is trying to sort of bridge the gap between the United States and China. And in many ways, I think if there is going to be sort of high-level summits that don't occur in Beijing or Washington, D.C., I think Singapore is a really great place to put them. Singapore has been dying because their ports are so small. And I say small because the city's so small. They're giant ports, right? The port of Singapore is incredibly huge. But they've been looking for a way to finally get that photo op of the United States Navy ship next to the PLA Navy ship, because it's one of the few countries that actually does have regular visits from both navies. Obviously, we make sure that those things don't happen. We push very hard diplomatically to make sure those things happen. But Singapore, in many ways, is trying to push for that image of itself as that bridge between between China and the United States. And then the other country is India. India is on the other side, right? Again, if you look at China's geopolitical situation, right? It's not us. It doesn't benefit from helpful geography. And so it has countries, disputed borders. It has hostile or ambivalent countries all around it. And for the Chinese-India tensions, right, just a few months ago, there were skirmishes, right? They shot at each other over their disputed territories. And it was one of those really sort of interesting things of you have great powers actually having these kinds of minor skirmishes. They both recognize what's at stake, right? The possibility of further escalation is terrifying for both nations and things. But they also recognize that they're both on the rise in many ways. We care more about China than we do about India, but let's not mistake India's growth and increasing role in the world. We shouldn't make a mistake about. We shouldn't diminish any of that. India, however, in terms of its attempts or our attempts to tie much more closely in with India, is an interesting problem because India is in fact the largest democracy in the world. What that means is it's one of the messiest governments in the world, right? It's gloriously messy, right? It's wonderfully messy, but it's really messy. What I mean by that then is what India has to do is it has to satisfy, at least to some extent, lots of different interests. It's a multi-party system. It's got all kinds of crazy single party interests that, because of how the government works, it's a parliamentary system, right? Single party dedicated followers can really impact the governments in ways that we don't see in our mostly two-party system. And so India then has this problem of not getting too close to the United States. Never obviously wants to get too close to China, but China-India trade is significant, right? And it doesn't want to view itself or be viewed as a third great power. Doesn't want to do that. And so India has this really interesting problem as the Indian scholars, South Asia scholars in my classes, college says, is India never wants to say it's a great power. It simply wants the military and diplomatic influence and capability to achieve its objectives, which is basically things like general control over the immediate South China, Indian Ocean, which is more than 12 nautical miles. It's talking about like it kind of looks at the Indian Ocean the way we used to look at the Pacific Ocean, as sort of the Indian Lake, right? A general sort of more amenable regional kind of geography in terms of better relations, or at least a more docile Pakistan, and Afghanistan that favors India, and obviously better relations with China, right? Once you draw all that stuff up, you go, wait, India doesn't want it said that it's a great power, but to do all of these things that India wants, it's got to be a great power. Just does, right? This isn't a wording thing. If you want to do all that, you got to be a great power. So India is in its own sort of internal identity, struggling with what it wants to be and how it wants to be seen in the world. And it does view closer United States-India ties to be problematic in that sense, because it either views itself as being then put under the United States, or if it's even as a co-great power with the United States, that bothers China and upsets this critical balance that India is trying to achieve for itself in the region. And so that's really sort of the problems that you see here. We keep thinking about this as a U.S.-China game, and then we leverage allies and partners as if they're just pieces on the chessboard, right? Or on the Go board, or whatever your game analogy you want it to be. But the problem is those pieces can move by themselves, right? They have their own interests, they have their own desires, and we ignore those kinds of things at our peril as well. All right, I went, I think, a little long. I apologize for that, but I can now open the floor to questions.
I'll ask the first one, and again, thanks for doing this. Recently you've had, or China's experienced its own domestic issues, and those are, to use a warfighting analogy, those are like the surfaces and gaps. And in my own perception, I look at Hong Kong and the rise of the popular democracy movement that is happening in Hong Kong. Its desire for independence, and really the people in Hong Kong have made a point to acknowledge that the Chinese government has not honored its agreements with the British government when it abdicated authority over Hong Kong. So you have that situation. You have its ongoing dispute with Mongolia, its lack of recognition of their own autonomous control or regional autonomous control. You have what's going on with the Muslim population in China. And so you have a number of real significant, I guess everything's just bigger on scale when you talk about China. But really, the Chinese government are really dealing with significant, massive issues that really pales in comparison to our own domestic challenges. And so when I look at the Chinese domestic political situation, I find that whatever conflict outward that may occur may be limited in scope and nature, just to obtain, I guess, short-term and regional goals. And I agree with much of what you said, but how I guess the question here is, what do you think the domestic political situation in China looks like? Am I interpreting this correctly? And then secondly, is that something that the U.S. government or our national security policy as we engage with whether the regional partners that have influence in these areas, do you think that's an avenue of approach, the gap, so to speak, for Chinese security? Over
Okay.
you.
Thank you. So the first part, so one of the things we say is that we note is that when we talk about China's security budget, they still spend more on their security budget for internal affairs than they do for external affairs. And that's Tibet, that's the Uyghurs, that's their national police, that is Hong Kong, that's not Taiwan. Taiwan does, no matter what they say about one China, when it comes to Taiwan, that budget is considered external. But they still spend more money to deal with internal tensions and problems than they do for external. And we should remember that, right? This is one of the problems of an authoritarian government, is that they don't rule by a social contract with the population. Hong Kong is interesting. One of the problems is they're absolutely right. The Hong Kong folks are absolutely right. The Chinese have not been honoring their agreements. But one of the problems for Hong Kong is that agreement does have a time horizon. The agreement ends in 2048, and in 2048, Hong Kong is. We currently have this sort of one party, two systems, one country, two systems thing when it comes to Hong Kong. They're all of the rights that the Hong Kongs are fighting for are the ones that are there for them. And don't exist for other Chinese citizens. But by 2048, Hong Kong falls completely under Chinese rule. That's what the agreement says. The reason the Brits allowed that, the reason the Brits actually went for that, is because we, the United States, the West, were fully convinced that over 50 years, you would see the evolution of China just into a liberal democratic state. And so, 50 years, you got it, right? We're 20 plus years down, and it's not looking good. But that's the deal. So in many ways, what you see for China, the Beijing response to the idea that, hey, you're not keeping your end of the deal by the Chinese is, well, yeah, but we're just moving a little early. I get it, you don't like it, and we're going to pull back. But just you wait, 2048, there's nothing to negotiate, right? This is the agreement you guys signed. We're just, we can hang on. We just thought we'd ease you in for some of these things now rather than later. So that'll be, I think, an interesting sort of problem. In terms of the inroads, so my general answer is no, only because it's one of those things that what the Chinese really do is when they are internally stable is when they start to flex their external muscles. But what gets them internally stable is not just the brutal suppression of any of these internal problems. It's the ability to point to external forces. Right? So you'll note that every time the Dalai Lama makes a meeting with Hollywood or whatever, or we broadcast the NBA, the Houston Rockets general manager says something nice about Hong Kong democracy. The Chinese accuse us of meddling. And when we get accused of meddling, then the issue is no longer this sort of organic internal tensions within Chinese society. It's the United States, especially the United States, big bad United States, interfering in the internal politics of the Chinese. So I would avoid sort of any kind of direct kind of sort of secret covert influence. That said, I think the larger kinds of inroads perhaps could be done by partners, could have some impacts, but the Chinese are taking it, again, doing very well in terms of managing these situations. They love basketball, but they don't have any problem condemning the Houston Rockets general manager for saying nice things about Hong Kong, right? They were loud enough that the NBA itself issued an apology, right? Issued an apology because a private citizen in the United States said something nice about the Hong Kong democracy movement, right? I mean, you can the influence again of not better ideas, but just better stuff or more money is significant, right? You guys all know the Top Gun Maverick is about to come out, right? They've reshot a bunch of scenes, or they actually redid the wardrobe. They removed one of Maverick's, Tom Cruise's patches, because the patch that he was wearing relates to a unit that fought for Taiwan, right? It was part of and so the Hollywood took that off because they realized, because they were sent a note. The production company was sent a note. China wasn't going to show that movie, right? China wasn't going to show that movie because they knew that patch, for them, that patch meant something, right? And so, if you guys remember the old the Red Dawn remake, if you will, right? The Red Dawn remake was supposed to be the Chinese. The Chinese were coming to invade the United States, and then, a young ragtag bunch of Americans were all going to go all Wolverines on these guys and stuff, right? And they had to change it. They shot the entire movie. They just recolorized all of the uniforms and flags to make that North Korea, because they wanted to show that movie in China, right? And China wasn't going to show that movie if it was the Chinese invading the United States, right? That's the kind of sort of economic leverage. This isn't about like propaganda or better idea stuff. This was just about the cold hard cash that the studios were wanted to make. This is about the NBA wanting to be able to visit China and make gobs of money by having tours through China, which apparently means that they're more willing to shut down statements for democracy out here than they are condemning things like Chinese actions in the Uyghurs, in Hong Kong, or whatever. So I think those kinds of fractures exist, but those fractures become problematic if we get involved in them. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, it does. Any other questions?
I do. So once again, good afternoon, and thank you for making time for us and have
Absolutely.
this discussion. Continuing with the economic or the power of the economic that China is looking to establish. I think it's easy to compare militarily how many ships we have in our frigates and so on. When we look at the economic power and the economic leverage, just like you used to mention, what do you see as the impact as they continue to build in their infrastructure, specifically with the Silk Roads, once they have those 9 or 10 different roads connecting all the way to England, so from sea to the other side of this, to the European Sea, as well as how they are basically distributing their economic channels across the world to include places like Venezuela and access to those ports in South America. How do you see that building up in the next 10, 20 years? And what's the impact? What's the so what for us as they continue to climb this economic power?
Okay, thank you. So I think in the next 20 years, things like the Belt Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road, things like port access are going to become more robust. And I think what that is here's the good news, if this is the good news, right? So the deal here is that China currently relies on mostly maritime lines of communication to get its resources. And those lines of communication go mostly through the Straits of Malacca, up through the South China Sea into China. The United States Navy still dominates in terms of freedom of navigation, still dominates the high seas. And in a situation of real tension, a maritime blockade of areas perhaps further out from Malacca, maybe closer to the South China Sea, any of those kinds of areas is really problematic for China, right? And so you get a Belt Road Initiative. You get the One Belt, One Road, because now if those resources come over land, right, come over several countries, and there are still some of the ports as well. But if that road alleviates some of the resources that can be blocked by interventionist powers, right, mostly the United States, that means you get a China that's more secure in its resource availability, right? And if you know history, right, one of the reasons Japan attacks the United States in 1941 is because we had been choking off their resources, right? We had been closing off their access to rubber, petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. And so they felt like they were going to get closed off and they needed to strike as soon as they could because times were getting desperate. a less desperate China may mean a less hostile China globally, at least in terms of the United States. But that also means that it's a more stable China, and therefore may be more willing to push the envelope on things it wants that, again, could be amenable to the situation. So the United States loses a clear lever with the One Belt One Road initiative. That's the bad news. Maybe the good news is this is why we need to get creative, right? This is no longer the case of simply we only have this one lever of this sort of naval blockade kind of issue. We got to figure out new ways to access or to impact China, because China is no longer going to be tied to these major maritime routes for resources. And I haven't even talked about whether or not the Arctic is going to be a line of communication for them. Right, that's completely out of where we've been discussing. But that One Belt One Road initiative is a way for China to lessen the ability of the United States to get at it in a very clear and direct manner. That's a detriment in terms of our current plans, but that might not necessarily be a detriment in terms of our future plans. We got to get creative. And on the other side of that, again, if you have other levers to impact how China changes, or maybe China over time, so far not so good, but as China perhaps evolves in ways that might become more liberal and democratic, then China that has these access points may not be a problem. So to that point, one of the things I think we, in terms of larger policy options, is we got to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? That's the thing we lost when we pulled out under the Trump administration, the first day actually of the Trump administration. That's a vacuum, this massive global market free trade zone that just isn't about free trade, but it was about these larger reforms in terms of financial transparency, things that look like OSHA requirements and worker safety, those kinds of things. We got out of that. You ask most Chinese scholars, and actually most people in the Chinese government on the economic side, that's the one that they point to. It's like the United States not getting into the Trans-Pacific Partnership left this huge vacuum in the Asia Pacific that we got to take advantage of. The Asia International Infrastructure Bank, those kinds of things that there's a RCEP, Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, I think is what it's called, that China set up because they were trying to alleviate the pain of the TPP. Once we didn't get into the TPP, the RCEP and the AIIB became more significant. We have countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, right? Our friends and allies have joined into these things because they haven't, and they wanted to simply keep the TPP. They're still members of that, but they're now members of this other thing. They wouldn't have joined RCEP or the AIIB, in my opinion, if we had stayed inside the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we got to think larger than just military as well.
And just to clarify, the RCEP and the AIIB, it's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Investment Bank, thank you.
Yeah. And those are the ones that are tied to, as I recall, those are the supporting efforts to the One Belt One Road initiative. That's how OBOR is able to spread its influence financially and obtain the loans. In this weird way, the Chinese are basically created banks that would underwrite and issue loans in order to build the projects that no one in their right mind would ever invest.
Correct.
I think it's in Fiji or somewhere in the South Pacific, the Chinese built a port facility that was larger than even the wildest expectations of what the requirement would be. And I think it's a nod to the reality of what it plans on putting there.
I think you're right. I think it might be Fiji, it might be Vanuatu. The last place I was in Vanuatu in Port Vila in 2015, and the port was still a sort of in its embryonic stages. But the brand new parliament building that the Chinese were building for the Vanuatu government was spectacular. They were very proud to give everybody who had just come to visit a tour of this building because they had christened it yet, but that building was absolutely spectacular. And I think you're absolutely right about that.
Wow. Interesting. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. So you talked about, when we went over allies and China's geopolitical area, we talked about India, we talked about Singapore, we talked about Japan, North Korea, but we haven't talked about Russia yet. Will we be able to look towards Russia to combat China should things go down that path? Because as much as we would see China as a threat on the economic scale, Russia would see it as a much larger threat because they share a large, well, they would then share a large border.
Yeah, and I think we downplay a lot of Russia-China tensions. There are a lot of reports that those tensions are higher than we think, notably because of what seem to be sort of, for lack of a better term, like squatter populations moving from the Chinese border over into the Russian border. There are vast expanses of uninhabited, right, sparsely inhabited areas of eastern Russia that apparently have become border towns, or not just border towns, but border cities with Chinese populations. And we don't really have a clear view of what those things are. I don't know if I could put the Chinese Russians in as an ally. I think the Russians are playing their own game here, and this is one of the problems. I think the Russians love rising U.S.-China tensions because that distracts us from them and distracts China from them, right? So the sort of the current status quo of like chaos and division and all of that stuff, Russia is all in. But the problem, of course, is at what point does Russia find itself in that problem of, holy crap, there's a war about to go on. I got to figure out where the hell I am. And I don't know where that is. I don't know where that point is and whether or not that means Russia and China have more in common, or Russia and the United States have more in common. And that's, I think, the real problem here. I think Russia's sort of day-to-day practices are not amenable to keeping stability in the region. But it's that tightrope that Russia is walking. They don't want a war, but they also don't want, an actual rapprochement between China and the United States.
Cool.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? All right, hey, sir, I know we're closing in on the hour.
I got time.
And I'll ask one more, then I'll hand it over to you for closing comments. But it's interesting to learn that you've participated in these war games, and with the marine littoral concept. I guess us Marines on the outer fringes of the Marine Corps empire, we're getting like little bits and pieces of what this marine littoral concept looks like and how we fit in all of it. And we read everything that the CMC puts out, and we march accordingly. But I think the question for you is, what is Dr. Eric Shibuya's version of what we should do and how we should form ourselves? And as a guy who's looked at the service for many years, and you've had the ability. One of the things I'm kind of envious of individuals like you is you get to sit on the outer fringes and really look at us, the service, from a perspective that a lot of us don't do, refuse to do, or can't do for many reasons. So, what is your perspective on this?
So, I think I love the concept of what previous commandant called middleweight force, right? Whatever that meant. And whenever people go, well, I don't know what that means. For me, that always meant light enough to move fast, heavy enough to stay. And one of the things that the increasing technology and capabilities of our adversaries is that the Marines are certainly light enough to get there, but have become the idea that you're heavy enough to stay has become increasingly problematic. And so that's one of the problems, I think, when we look at any of our organizational concepts. Now, on that score, when it comes to something like the MLR, I think things like increasingly distributed operations has become more important. which means that being able to recomposite, right, is going to be more critical. It's going to be the critical capability of any Marine Corps regiment, division, whatever it is, at whatever you being able to recomposite and be ready to go in that sense. When it comes to cultural identity for the Marine Corps, and I know you're up there surrounded by soldiers, but so when we do joint operations and I teach a seminar here, I jokingly start the seminar by having every student, right, whatever service they are, but if you're a Marine, I have you walk, you have to go around the room and you have to say something nice about every other service, right? Every soldier has to say something nice about every other service. And it starts as a joke, right? But then it gets serious, right? And one of the serious notions for the Marines is they go, when it comes down to it, right? This is taking a feather out of the cap of Major General Dale Alford, who's a dear friend of mine. General Alford always says, we have to understand our role. We have to be okay with it. He's a proud Marine. And he says, listen, Marines win battles. We got to be good with this because it's an important battle. People sing about battles, but Marines win battles. I need to put Marines down here to win this battle. The reason we win this battle is so that when big army can show up, we just part the ways and they can go over the hill and win the war, right? But we need to get over ourselves and know our role. Marines win battles. And I love this idea, right? Because the idea isn't about, the silly service travels that we joke about or anything like that. It's about understanding where you are in the joint fight. Battles are important because battles lead to further advances in the war. And Big Iron Mountain showing up, big army showing up with all of the stuff, right? That's the thing. So as one of my students said, when I told him that story, he says, no, I get it, sir. The thing I love about being a Marine is that when I see the army show up, I know the game is over. The enemy is done, right? This is it. Army shows up, I go, thank you very much, go on. And that's the thing I think we have to remember our concepts. I think when we look at the MLR, it's about winning battles. And I think so far, at least in terms of how we're looking at execution, we still haven't figured where that battle is. And we still haven't figured out the concept of recompositing. And those are the two things that I think are going to be really the most important part about making whatever force design the Marine Corps has to face in the next 20 years useful. We don't know where the next battle is. I get that we're focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. That I think makes a whole lot of sense. But when it comes to, we need to be more distributed, you need to be more distributed, be able to recomposite quickly, and then move forward to win whatever battle we set you out to. I don't think we've gotten that far yet. I don't think we've really figured out how we can effectively recomposite. My dear friend, Colonel Juarez is still out there in 3rd Marines. And I got to see him last January. I got to take a quick trip to Hawaii before the pandemic hit really bad. And I got to come out and we spent 2-3 hours sitting on his porch overlooking Kaneohe Bay and having that discussion. Because I thought he was about to take command of the MLR, but he's gonna change the command before that happens. And he says, no, I've been thinking about that as well. I don't know what it means to be distributed and have to come together quickly when it comes to that fight. And that, I think, is the dilemma we're still facing.
All right, sir. Well, I appreciate it. I'll leave it up to you for any final comments before we sign off.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I always love doing these things. Colonel Sicano's got my email, as well as anybody out here in Quantico. If it's not about the Indo-Pacific, we got a host of other specialties. And listen, we'll be happy to do these kinds of things. I speak for my whole faculty. I know that. We'd be happy to do any of these kinds of things if you're ever looking for anything like this again. One of the things the pandemic, I think, has taught us is the ability to do these kinds of virtual meetings is invaluable, and we should do more of those kinds of things. In terms of final remarks over Indo-PACOM, I'll leave you with one last dilemma, which is the other dilemma I think that we don't think about often enough. We very often, and Colonel Sicano actually pointed this out when we were talking about the internal tensions and problems in China. we spend more of our time worried about China rising and overtaking the United States. And I totally get that. That makes the most sense for us to consider. But as Chinese scholars tell me, and I think this is a really interesting discussion, it says China is currently not worried about taking over from the United States. They're perfectly happy, for the most part, free riding on the rules-based system that the United States has started and has maintained. But certainly over the last 4 years, and that this was certainly the discussions I had during the previous administration, the Chinese were thinking about what it meant to take over a global system if the United States either withdrew from it, right? This is the debate over whether or not President Trump would become more isolationist, or if not deliberately isolationist, right? What happens if POTUS, right, upsets the rest of the democratic world so much that they refuse to follow him, right? That this idea that personalities matter so much that if everybody just said, no, I don't like this guy, I'm not even going to listen to him. And so China was also facing, in many ways, what I would call their own kind of contingency plan, right? Their own kind of branch plan. Perfectly happy free riding on the United States' global world order, but wondering what would happen if the United States either exited or was, in many ways, expelled from that order. And that was, in many ways, what China feared, I think, the most over these last 4 years, this idea that they would end up having to carry the load that they weren't ready or willing to do.
All right, well, I'll leave it at that. All right, sir, thank you.
Thank you. Like I said, call us anytime. We'd be happy to help.